Series of popular science films. History. Fact or fiction. This film contains material from the new chronology of Fomenko Nasovsky. The makers of the film express their thanks to Fomenko and Nasovsky. He who controls the past controls the future. George Orwell, 1984. The central book of Christianity, the Bible, contains many secrets. One of them is the construction of Jerusalem, described in the Old Testament in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. These books tell us that Jerusalem was captured by troops of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and was totally destroyed, but was restored 70 years later. However, the Bible does not tell us whether Jerusalem was rebuilt on the same spot where it stood before being destroyed by the Babylonian army. Another fact is curious. It is well known that there have been several versions of the Bible. In different versions, there are different descriptions of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. For example, in the canonical synodal translation of the Bible, published in the 19th century, the story of the rebuilding of Jerusalem uses the word repair for the restoration. They repaired the walls. They repaired the gates. Yet in older versions of the Bible, published in the 16th century, they use the word create or build. It seems that in an older version of the Bible, the book of Nehemiah directly and exactly describes the construction of a completely new Jerusalem and not the restoration of the former destroyed city. The later editors of the Bible needed this slight change from the word build to the word repair in order to convey that Jerusalem was rebuilt on the site of the former capital city and not in a new location. But that leaves us with the question, where exactly was Jerusalem built? The Moscow Kremlin. Russian scholars Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nasovsky have been working for many years on a reconstruction of the real story based on a new chronology. They have studied hundreds of ancient records and documents, analyzing the text of the Bible with the help of their own original mathematical and statistical methods. The scholars reached a conclusion which confounded even them. One of the amazing facts we brought to light in analyzing the Bible is the discovery that in a well-known book of the Old Testament, the book of Nehemiah, it seems that there is a description of the Moscow Kremlin in the 16th century. This hypothesis from the very beginning dumbfounded even us. The idea arose from purely chronological reasoning. According to our research, it appears that the biblical description of the construction of Jerusalem actually refers to the 16th century. But at that time in the history of the Middle Ages, there was only one case of the construction of a major holy city, the construction of the Moscow Kremlin. And I'd like to point out that according to our research, the Kremlin was built in the 16th century, not in the 15th century, as historians have thought, but actually a century later. A comparison of the biblical description and the description from the Middle Ages shows that it actually makes sense to consider if the biblical description is actually referring to the building of the Kremlin. Part 1. When was Moscow built? At first glance, Fomenko and Nasovsky's suggestion that the Bible might describe the construction of the Moscow Kremlin sounds paradoxical. Indeed, It is generally considered that the building of Jerusalem, as described in the book of Nehemiah, occurred long before the birth of Christ, more than 2,000 years ago. What does that have to do with the building of the Kremlin? And why did these scholars conclude that the ancient fortress was built in the 16th century and not the 15th? History maintains that the white stone Kremlin of Ivan Kalita replaced the Kremlin built during the reign of Ivan III, and that it was constructed in the 15th century. But in the middle of the 16th century, at the very beginning of the reign of Ivan the Terrible, a fire destroyed the Kremlin. Therefore, Ivan the Terrible had to rebuild it. But the authors of the new chronology absolutely disagree. They are convinced that Ivan the Terrible didn't rebuild the Moscow Kremlin, but rather built it from scratch. This can be inferred from the history of the construction of the fortress walls of Moscow. It is generally accepted that the first ring of walls, that is, the walls of the Kremlin, were completed in the beginning of the 16th century. The construction of the second ring of fortress walls, called Kitai Gorod, was completed only by the year 1600. This fact deserves special attention, because for a city there is nothing more important than its defensive fortifications, even more so for a capital. According to the generally accepted historical version, it would seem that in the 15th century, both the builders of Moscow and the leaders of the government didn't understand to what degree it was necessary to build several rows of fortress walls. Wars were sweeping the countryside. Moscow had been attacked by the Crimean Khans, but Muscovites had to wait 100 years before they finally built a second fortress wall. And the third wall, Belый Gorod, was only built in the beginning of the 17th century. It seems that the Russian rulers needed 200 years to strengthen the defenses of their city to the standards of military technology of the time. Yet in Constantinople, for example, they already had the exact same plan of 3 rings of walls. It is logical to suppose that in Moscow, the construction was carried out according to the same rules. Without such defenses, the Moscow Kremlin would have been easy prey for an enemy, but we know that in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was never attacked. There is one other curious fact. Sigismund von Herberstein, an Austrian diplomat, wrote a book called Notes on Muscovite Affairs. Baron Herberstein visited Russia twice, in 1517 and in 1529. In his book, he described in great detail his travels in Moscow and even included a detailed plan of the Moscow Kremlin. However, there doesn't seem to be any similarity between his plan and the appearance of the actual Kremlin. Anyone who has seen the Moscow Kremlin will see that the number of towers, gates, and cathedrals depicted in the plan don't match. The outer appearance also has nothing in common with reality. The only similarity is the depiction of the city at the confluence of 2 rivers. But according to the accepted timeline, by the time of Herberstein's travels, the construction of the Kremlin was already complete. Why then didn't the Austrian diplomat depict the Kremlin as it was, but instead some other fortress? Unfortunately, historians don't have a good answer to this question. It is thought that he simply drew a generalized plan. However, the authors of the new chronology don't see anything strange. Herberstein simply couldn't draw a correct plan of the Moscow Kremlin because at the time of his travels, it hadn't been built yet. At best, it was still being built, but hadn't yet reached its finished appearance. Part 2. When did the Bible appear? It is generally accepted that the Bible was written more than 2,000 years ago. How then could its pages contain a description of the construction of the Moscow Kremlin, which happened in the 16th century? Some historians suggest that the architect merely took the description of ancient Jerusalem from the book of Nehemiah as a model and built the Moscow fortress according to the biblical description. But the authors of the New Chronology don't find this explanation convincing either. They believe the age of the biblical texts are exaggerated. As we discovered, the Bible was written and edited up to the 16th and even 17th centuries. We studied the timeline for the creation of the Bible for a long time and came to the conclusion that the modern version of the Bible is a reasonably late version. The Bible today is a collection of certain books, and many believe that it appeared a long time ago. Some say 1,000 years ago, some say more. But in actuality, the contents of the biblical canon aren't that ancient. Until the 16th century, the books of the Old and New Testaments existed separately, and a unified canon didn't even exist. There are around 500 Slavo-Russian biblical manuscripts from the 9th to the 13th centuries in Russian archives. There are the Gospels, Psalters, Revelations, and others. But there isn't a single Bible in the modern understanding of the word. Some might be surprised to learn that in the 15th century, the New Testament included more books than today. The opposite is true of the Old Testament. Some books that exist today were missing. They appeared later, in the canonical collection. In other words, even in the 16th century, the Old Testament wasn't complete. This point is witnessed in part in the main church book of the time, the Kormchaya Kniga, a book on canonical law, whose lists were compiled with precision. The first printed Bible only appeared in Russia in 1581. This was the well-known Ostrog Bible of Ivan Fyodorov. In fact, in the foreword to his publication, the Russian printer wrote that he experienced more difficulty in the search for incomplete biblical books. So, in dating the appearance of the first Russian canonical Bible, it is only possible to say with certainty the 16th century. In other Orthodox communities, the canonical Bible appeared even later. For example, it appeared in Greece 300 years after the Bible of Ivan Fyodorov in the 19th century. As for Europe, the Catholic Church recognized the biblical canon only in 1545, at the Council of Trent. This means that the Latin canonical Bible also appeared in the 16th century. Traditional history doesn't have an exact logical explanation for the late unification of the disparate biblical texts into a common canon. There also isn't a clear explanation for the absence in the 16th century of the books of Chronicles, Judith, and Maccabees from the Old Testament. There was no book of Ezra and no book of Nehemiah. It follows that if in the 16th century there was no book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, then the builders of the Moscow Kremlin couldn't have used it as a model. On the contrary, if we assume that the book only appeared at the end of the 16th century, then that means that the book was created at the same time as the construction of the Moscow Kremlin and could in fact be an account of those events. This event is well known in biblical history. There has been a great deal of research and inquiry about it, and it is important to many people today because the idea that the Second Jerusalem described in the Bible is actually Moscow in the 16th century is not an insignificant point, but rather a very serious fact. And it changes a great deal, not only in our perception of the history of Moscow, but of the history of the Bible in general, especially the Old Testament. We will now follow the travels of the biblical Nehemiah and, using concrete examples, examine how amazingly similar the Moscow Kremlin is to the Jerusalem of the Old Testament. We will use the text of the book of Nehemiah, taken not from one Bible, but from three, from different years of publication. In fact, the biblical texts were not simply rewritten and republished, but from publication to publication, they were thoroughly edited and changed. Therefore, a comparison of different texts will make our investigation more precise. The first text is from the Ostrog Bible, published in 1581 by the publisher Ivan Fyodorov by order of Duke Konstantin Ostrogsky. The second Bible is a reprinted publication of the Elizabeth Bible, which was published by command of Yelizaveta Petrovna in 1751. And finally, we will examine the most recognizable version for a modern reader, the Russian Bible, also known by the name the Russian Synodal Bible, which appeared in 1876. Part 3. Towers and Gates. According to the book of Nehemiah, along with the construction of the fortress walls of Jerusalem, they also built 6 fortress gates. Their construction is also described in the texts. And they built such gates and placed doors in them. It is known that there were 6 fortress gates in the Moscow Kremlin when it was built, exactly the same number as in the fortress of Jerusalem described in the Bible. Today, some of the gates have been sealed in, but in numerous old drawings and plans of the Moscow Kremlin from the end of the 16th to the 18th centuries, there are 6 gates. It is clearly visible on the first exact map of the Kremlin, called the Kremlin Grot. The Sheep, or Spassky Tower. The first gates that come to mind from the Bible are the sheep gates, or herd gates. These gates refer to the Spassky gates of the Moscow Kremlin. In several places in the Bible, they are called the Jerusalem gates. The Spassky gates were also called the Jerusalem gates because they exited onto Jerusalem, another name for the Cathedral of Vasily the Blessed, or St. Basil's Cathedral. This is noted on several engravings, one of which is on display in the Museum of New Jerusalem in Istra, outside of Moscow. Through these gates on Palm Sunday, the Patriarch would perform the symbolic procession on a foal to the Moscow Jerusalem, the majestic Pokrovsky Cathedral. This was a ritual journey on a donkey, symbolizing the entrance of Jesus Christ into Jerusalem. These gates were also called the Fralovsky gates. It's possible that not far from the Spassky gates, there used to be a church of Saint Floris. It is well known that Saints Floris and Lauris are the patron saints of horses and horned cattle. That is why cathedrals in their honor were built near places with many animals. On old plans of the Kremlin, rows of shopping stalls across from the Spassky gates and next to the Pokrovsky Cathedral are labeled as shops where hides of various animals are sold. And the bank of the Moscow River at this point, across from the Kremlin, is known to this day as Ovchinnikovskaya, so the Spassky gates could easily be called either Sheep Gates or Jerusalem Gates. The Fish or Konstantin Yeleninsky Gates. After the Sheep Gates, the Bible speaks of the Fish Gates. They perfectly correspond to the Konstantin Yeleninsky Tower. This tower gets its name from the church of Saints Constantine and Yelena, equal in stature to the apostles, built not far away in the Tainitsky garden of the Kremlin. Until 1917, this church was an ordinary parish temple. In 1928, the Bolsheviks destroyed the church. Originally, the tower contained a passageway into the Kremlin with gates. In the 18th century, the passageway through the Konstantin Yeleninsky Tower was destroyed, and the gates filled in, but they are clearly visible on an old plan of the Kremlin from that time. Across from the Konstantin-Yeleninsky gates of the Moscow Kremlin, there used to be rows of shopping stalls where they sold fish. To this day, there's a side street called Fish Alley. Those gates could full well be called the Fish Gates. The Old or Nikolsky Gates. The next gates named in the Bible are the Old Gates. They refer to the Nikolsky Gates. Moving along the walls of the Moscow Kremlin from the Spassky Gates along Red Square, to the right we arrive at these gates. The Nikolaevsky or Nikolsky Kremlin gates take their name from the Nikolsky Greek monastery. It was located not far from Nikolsky Street. This street has for a long time been known for its educational institutions, bookshops, and printing houses. Next to the grounds of the monastery is a building which today houses the Historical Archives Institute. But in the 16th century, it contained a printing house and the synodal print shop. This is where Ivan Fyodorov printed the first Russian book. The Nikolsky Monastery was also called the Nikola the Elder Monastery. Thus, the full name of the Nikolsky Gates matches the biblical name. The Dirty or Trinity Gates. Further along we come to gates called the Dirty Gates in the Ostrog Bible, and in the Elizabethan Bible, the Foul Gates. Their description is strikingly similar to the Trinity Gates in the Moscow Kremlin. The Trinity and Kutafya towers combined to form the Trinity Bridge, which was built across the Niglinka River and connected the Kremlin with the right bank of the river, which was called Zaniglimenные. From the 15th to the 17th centuries, the Niglinka was muddy and dirty. Its banks were rather unsightly and always swamped with sewage from the surrounding residencies. How could this not be the Dirty Gates? The Lowland or Borovitsky Gates. Continuing on, we come to the Borovitsky Gates. In the Bible, they correspond to the Dolny Gates or Lowland Gates. The Borovitsky Tower is located on the southwest slope of Borovitsky Hill. Originally, the tower was a large quadrangle covered with a wooden tented roof. Judging by the filled-in archway, in the 16th century the gates would open a path not onto the hill, but only to the hem of the Kremlin. The low bank part of the Kremlin area has long been called the Hem. The Barbican, located to the side of the tower, was built later, at the end of the 17th century. Thus the gates, going out onto the Hem, originally could have been called the Lowland Gates, or Gates of the Valley. In the Bible they have a unique description. And they repaired 1,000 cubits of the wall to the dirty gates. This is the only instance the Bible gives us on the construction of Jerusalem. The Bible's author used a unit of measurement called a cubit. This unit was used by many peoples, but there is no standard reference for that length. It represented the distance from the elbow joint to the tip of the extended middle finger. In order to determine the length of wall between the gates of the valley and the dirty gates, we will use the most common unit of length from antiquity, the Syrian cubit. We will then compare that number to the distance between the Trinity and Borovitsky towers of the Kremlin. If we look up the Syrian cubit in an encyclopedia, we find that it equals 37 centimeters. Multiplying that by the distance between the dirty gates and the gates of the valley given in the Bible, we find that 1,000 cubits is 370 meters. If we compare that to the distance between the Trinity and Borovitsky gates of the Kremlin, which measures 380 meters, then the difference is only 10 meters.
380 метров.
This fits remarkably well.
Совершенно идеальная.
Gates of the Fountain, or Tainitsky Gates. The last mention of gates in the Bible refers to the construction of the gates of the fountain. In the Kremlin, they correspond to the gates of the Tainitsky Tower. These were the only gates on the section of the Kremlin wall that runs along the Moscow River. In this tower, there was a passageway with gates and a barbican which connected the tower with a stone bridge. This raised bridge granted access to the barbican. The Tainitsky Tower was very important for the defense of the Kremlin from the direction of the river. The tower also contained a well and a secret exit to the Moscow River.
Таким образом, все 6 ворот Московского Кремля.
It works out that all 6 gates of the Moscow Kremlin completely coincide with their biblical names, in the exact order in which the biblical gates of Jerusalem are listed. The parallel is simply ideal, that's all there is to it.
Соответствие просто идеальное, и на этом оно не кончается.
Besides the gates, the book of Nehemiah also tells us that there were towers without gates in the fortress walls of Jerusalem. Next, we will compare these towers with those of the Moscow Kremlin. The towers of Mea and Hananel. According to the book of Nehemiah, between the sheep and fish towers of Jerusalem stood the towers of Mea and Hananel. In the Kremlin, the sheep and fish towers are represented by the Spassky and Konstantin Yeleninsky towers. Between these towers there are 2 other towers, the Nabatnaya and the Tsar's Tower. The Tsar's Tower is in fact built on top of a wall. In contrast to the other towers, this is the only one that doesn't jut out from the Kremlin walls. According to legend, Ivan the Great would watch people on Red Square from this tower, which is why it is called the Tsar's Tower. The Stove, or Corner Tower. Let's read further. Between the old gates and another pair of gates, the Bible tells us of another tower. In the book of Nehemiah, it is called the Stove Tower. Looking at the Kremlin, the old gates in our case are the Nikolsky gates, and the pair of others are the Trinity and Borovitsky towers, located in one wall. Between the Nikolsky and Borovitsky gates is the corner Arsenal Tower. At first glance, there is nothing to connect the names Stove and Corner Towers. However, in many old buildings, a structure at a corner wasn't called corner, uglovoy in modern Russian, but rather kol, ugolny. Therefore, it isn't out of the question to assume that the biblical author, having heard the name of the tower, simply mixed up the stress, and instead of the word ugolnaya, corner, it became ugolnaya, coal. And as coal is associated with stoves, the tower came to be known as the Stove Tower. It is interesting to note that in the description of the construction of Jerusalem in the book of Nehemiah, they mentioned only these 3 towers without gates. Looking at the Moscow Kremlin, it doesn't seem strange. Indeed, it is thus described: the mightiest fortress tower and 2 other towers located across from the Pokrovsky Cathedral, towers from which one can see Red Square, where all of the main events of Moscow in the Middle Ages happened. So, we've walked along the walls of the Moscow Kremlin from the outside. Now let's go inside and continue the journey of the biblical Nehemiah. Churches and palaces. The city of David. The first building mentioned in the synodal translation of the book of Nehemiah is located not far from the gates of the fountain. It is the city of David and the Tsar's garden. In the Ostrog Bible, instead of the Tsar's garden, they talk about the Tsar's squares, which are reached by stairs leading down from the city of David. The gates of the fountain, according to the version of Fomenko and Nasovsky, are 2 squares, 1 are the gates in the Tainitsky Tower. The squares are the Cathedral Square, and the City of David is the Tsar's palace. Now, let's turn to an old description of the Kremlin. In the Middle Ages, on that spot, stood the Tsar's palace. The Great Kremlin Palace was built only in the middle of the 19th century. From the old Tsar's palace, there remains only the Terem Palace, the Tsarina Golden Palace, and the Palace of Facets. The Palace of Facets, in antiquity, had an exit onto Cathedral Square via the Red Terrace and staircase. This aligns perfectly. The City of David is the Tsar's palace. The steps leading onto the square are the red staircase leading onto Cathedral Square. Russian rulers went out onto this terrace to show themselves to the people. From there, they would parade to the Dormition Cathedral for coronations. From the Red Terrace and Tsar's staircase resounded the Tsar's proclamations. Therefore, it isn't surprising that this is where the biblical story begins. Tombs of the Davidovs. Further on, following in the path of Nehemiah, are the tombs of the Davidovs. In the Ostrog Bible, they are called the Cavern of the Grave of Davidov. What does this cavern have in common with a tomb? Originally, the word cavern meant an enclosed, clandestine place. Therefore, the Ostrog Bible, which refers to the sepulchre as a cavern, is more accurate than the later synodal translation, which mentions only tombs, as tombs can be either enclosed or open air. But on our path around the grounds of the Kremlin, we come to the Cathedral of the Archangel. This cathedral, to this day, serves as the burial vault of the Russian Tsars. A large part of the cathedral is filled with tombs. This isn't surprising, as the Archangel Michael is considered not only the patron saint of battle, but also the conveyor of souls to the kingdom of the dead. The Court of the Brave. Further on, Nehemiah comes to the Court of the Brave, near the Rybaritsa. First, we need to explain what the Rybaritsa is. In the Ostrog Bible, it says that the Rybaritsa was created by a great deed, which means it was constructed. That means the Bible is referring to some sort of structure. In Russian, the word for fish is ryba, so the name Rybaritsa is very similar to that of the fish gates. In the Kremlin, as we explained, the fish gates were located in the Konstantino-Yeleninsky Tower. Across from the Konstantino-Yeleninsky Tower is the Khobra Court, or Armory. This fits the Court of the Brave and the Rybaritsa. It's interesting that the author of the synodal translation, for some reason, in the description of the Rybaritsa, replaced the phrase "created with a great deed" with the phrase "dugout pond." In this simple way, the tower became a pond. The Armory on the corner. Approaching the next point along the journey of Nehemiah, we again find that the Bible was rewritten and added to. Judge for yourself. In the Ostrog Bible, Nehemiah comes to a place opposite an entrance to the strongest corner. But in the synodal translation, it is described differently, opposite an escapement to the arms in the corner. In both descriptions, there is reference to a corner. But in the synodal translation, there is mention of arms, but not in the Ostrog Bible. Continuing on from the Rybaritsa, that is from the Konstantino-Yeleninsky Tower along the Kremlin walls, past the Nikolsky Tower, we come to a corner and approach the great corner arsenal tower of the Kremlin. As we already said, this is the most massive Kremlin tower, sinking under its own weight deep into the ground. And it would be fair to call the most massive tower the strongest corner. But what about the arms from the synodal translation? This is exactly where the Kremlin armory was once located, once again, an exact match. But the armory was only built in 1701 by order of Peter I. In the 16th century, there wasn't an armory here. Therefore, it isn't mentioned in the Ostrog Bible. Obviously, the biblical author in the 16th century would describe the place as it was at the time. But then why did someone add the word arms to the synodal translation? Perhaps because that someone knew what was actually being described. Home of the great priest. Turning from the corner to the left, Nehemiah approaches the home of the great priest. In order to move in that direction in the Moscow Kremlin, we need to turn to the left from the corner Arsenal Tower. Passing by several unimportant structures, we arrive at the court of the Patriarch, near the Dormition Cathedral. The Bible is absolutely correct to call either the home of the Moscow Patriarch, or perhaps even the Dormition Cathedral itself, the home of the great priest. The tall column. We will now return to the point from which we started our journey around the Moscow Kremlin to Cathedral Square. The last structure on the path of Nehemiah is a tall column near the Tsar's palace. The Tsar's palace and Cathedral Square sit on a hill, but the biblical author arrives even to an incline and even to a corner. What column is located near the Tsar's palace in the Kremlin? It is, of course, the bell tower of Ivan the Great. We should note that in the 16th century, it looked different than it does today. It looked more like a column, as it was enlarged later in the 17th century. The Bible calls the structure in Jerusalem a column which rises high, and a guidebook of the Moscow Kremlin would call the Ivan the Great bell tower a three-tiered column-shaped structure. The equine gates and the gates of Gamifkad. The Bible goes on to tell us that from the main square, Nehemiah proceeds to the equine gates. Turning from Cathedral Square to the right, we come out straight to the Borovitsky gates. Today, the armory is located there, but earlier there was a special yard for horses. This is already the second mention of the Borovitsky gates in the book of Nehemiah, and once again, it matches perfectly. Not only the Borovitsky gates, but also the Trinity gates are mentioned twice. At the end of his journey, Nehemiah ends up at the gates of Gamifkad, or the doors of judgment. And the Trinity gates of the Kremlin could also be called not only the dirty gates, but even the gates of judgment, because near them, to the left, stood the judgment palace. With this biblical description, the Jerusalem fortress ends. The Spring of Dragons. What have we missed moving around the Kremlin, following the described path of Nehemiah around Jerusalem? We skipped only those buildings which appeared in the Kremlin much later than the 16th century, that is, in the 18th and even 19th centuries. The names and locations of all the ancient structures listed in the Bible completely match with similar structures of the Moscow Kremlin. Even the description of the countryside around Jerusalem, as described in the book of Nehemiah, is similar to the landscape around the Kremlin.
Можно сказать, в драконовом источнике тоже очень интересный
Let's look
момент.
at the Spring of Dragons. This is also a very interesting point. Nehemiah, according to the Bible, goes to Jerusalem, passing by the Spring of Dragons.
Находится, согласно Библии, недалеко от...
The Spring of Dragons is located, according to the Bible, not far from the gates of the valley. And in fact, next to the Borovitsky gates of the Moscow Kremlin, there used to be a devil's brook. So if we can equate the ancient words for dragon and devil, and Dahl, a language specialist, wrote that even in the old Russian language the words devil and dragon were synonyms, then the Devil's Brook is the spring of dragons. That the similarities between the Bible descriptions and the Moscow Kremlin of the 16th century even include such minute details is amazing. This is the Prichistinskaya Square of Moscow. Here, a small devil's stream intersected with the road to the Borovitsky gates of the Kremlin. Some called it a stream, others a brook. The Chertorsky gates of the Bielый Gorod, the third ring of fortress walls of Moscow, were located here. In 1658, by order of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, they were renamed Prichistinsky. Next to them was a market square. The Chertori flowed along this square and made life unpleasant for the townspeople. After it rained, the brook would overflow and flood the square with water. Therefore, in 1870, they constructed an underground pipeline. Until 1933, the Church of the Intercession on the Dirt stood there. Today, it is the above-ground platform of the Kropotkinskaya metro station. Near the metro is a side street, which to this day is called Chertorsky Alley. Jerusalem in the snow. Besides descriptions of the architecture and features of Jerusalem, the Bible also contains a curious description of the climate of the ancient city. We'll turn our attention now to another book of the Old Testament, the first book of Ezra, in which the reconstruction of Jerusalem is also described. In part, the book describes how the inhabitants of Jerusalem were called to gather in the city's squares. Here we again see that the text of the Bible was constantly being edited and changed from edition to edition. Here is how the event is described in the Ostrog Bible. And all the people of Judea and Benjamin gathered in Jerusalem in the 9th month, on the 20th day of the month. Acknowledge your sins before God in winter. It was the time of snow, and it was too strong to stand in it. It is clearly stated in the Ostrog Bible that there was snow in winter in Jerusalem when it was so cold that people couldn't stand on the street. But the description of such a grim winter appears today only in the Ostrog Bible. In later texts, it is clear to see the corrections of an editor. In the Elizabeth Bible, the phrase "time of snow" is changed to "winter time." Thus, with one word, the traces of the snowy and frosty winter are smoothed over in the Old Testament. The editors of the Synodal translation went even further and completely erased from the pages of the Bible the reference to snow. Today, in the modern canonical Bible, the phrase reads thus: "The people were numerous, and the time rainy, and there was no possibility to stand on the street." Gradually, the description of the cold northern climate disappeared from the Bible altogether.
В каноническом переводе говорится о том, что начался дождь.
In the canonical translation, it says that it started to rain, and that scared the soldiers standing there. They started to murmur that they should disperse. This seems strange, as rain wouldn't be enough to scare soldiers experienced in battle. Moreover, in Palestine, where would such a strong rain come from? It is a hot, dry place, a scorching desert.
Конечно, описание
Of course, the description of the old text of Nehemiah, where it talks of snow and bitter cold, categorically contradicts the climatic conditions of modern Palestine and Israel. And of course, in order to minimize the contradiction, they made those changes. Moscow, Jerusalem. And so we've compared the Kremlin with the description of Jerusalem from the book of Nehemiah, and we've seen that the version presented by the authors of the new chronology looks very convincing, albeit paradoxical. This new historical variant won't find room on the Procrustean couch of traditional history. But the comprehension of history involves more than just the study of books already written. It is a continuous search for new, still unknown facts about the past, the thorough study of these facts, and possibly also their re-evaluation. Therefore, the research of Fomenko and Nosovsky allows us to see a different, original picture of historic events.
Эта картина, конечно, является пока предположительной.
And this picture, of course, is still suppositional. We're putting it forth as a hypothesis, but it does conform to the biblical descriptions, and I'll say again, it isn't just fiction that appeared out of nowhere. It is our attempt to explain, purely formally, our chronological conclusion, based on the biblical descriptions of the destruction and rebuilding of Jerusalem. It refers to the 16th century.
Они относятся в XVI век.
Nonetheless, to a modern person, especially to a religious person, it might be difficult to accept this historical version. If the book of Nehemiah, in speaking about Jerusalem, is in fact speaking about the Moscow Kremlin, then why didn't the biblical author say that he was talking about Moscow, about the Russian capital? Why was it necessary to confuse things?
Не нужно думать, что кто-то специально маскировал.
There is no reason to think that someone intentionally masked the text of Nehemiah in order to make it unrecognizable. It was written by people who use their own language, their own symbols, and their own specifics. The book is an original chronicle written in the 16th century. The events are real enough, but it stands to reason that they are described in their own language, with specific names for the towers and for the people involved in the construction. It is likely that not only in the 16th century, but also later, it was understood by citizens of the Russian capital, as well as foreigners, that the book of Nehemiah was describing the construction of the Kremlin. It was even clear on the title page of the first printed Moscow Bible, published in 1663 by order of Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich. In the center of the page was a drawing of a plan of Moscow. Above the drawing is written, rise up, Jerusalem." It is amazing that this is written for some reason backwards, as a mirror image. Perhaps they were hiding from the non-initiated? It seems that this is directly naming Moscow as Jerusalem. But Ivan Zabelin, a 19th century Russian historian, wrote in his book A History of the City of Moscow that it was called Jerusalem thanks to the Germans who came to Moscow. There is no other capital from the Middle Ages that can even compare to the Moscow Kremlin. And of course, such a feat of construction amazed many at the time. The admiration, the delight, the feelings it raised in people were reflected in the Bible. There is nothing surprising in the fact that such a major event found its way into the Bible. The history of the construction of the Moscow Kremlin isn't the only discovery made by the authors of the new chronology from their examination of the texts of the Bible. Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky, applying their own original methods, have been working for decades on the creation of an original history of mankind. Having studied and correlated a huge number of documents, they reached the conclusion that we are separated from the events of the Bible not by 2, 3, or 4,000 years, but by much less. Most importantly, the majority of these events occurred in the Middle Ages in Russia, and therefore are a part of Russian history. It fell to Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nasovsky to undertake a complete reconstruction of the events of world history, which called for a new, correct timeline. We'll discuss it in our next film, The Reconstruction of History.